Hi, this is Paul, and as promised on Twitter today, I wanted to make a video about a tweet sent by Bret Weinstein. Now, as I said on Twitter too, I have abundant respect for Bret, and part of why do you pick on Bret so hard? Sometimes people ask me in the comment section. Well, I think because Bret can be picked on because Bret's a well-functioning adult, and he knows how to have a conversation with differences. And so I mean no ill will or anything towards Bret with anything that I'm about to say, but we're going to talk about ideas here, and I think we should really work hard we can be very hard on ideas, and we should be very loving towards people. Jesus did not say love your neighbor's ideas. Jesus said love your neighbor. So Bret had a tweet in which he was responding to a tweet by Kenton Claassen saying, "Love your work, but I'm with the rest of them. He should and will always be trending." I think meaning Jesus. Regardless of who you believe, regardless of if you believe in his divinity or not, he is the most influential person in history. And Bret writes back, "If you want to assert Jesus' importance as a moral philosopher, consider abandoning the magical claims. These ideas are at cross purposes in the 21st century." And obviously, this issue is very much at the center of a lot of my videos and my conversations with John Vervaeke and the conversations that I have on my channel between myself and atheists, and sort of what I do in my channel. So there's a bunch of things in this tweet. One is Jesus a moral philosopher, someone who dispenses guidance, guidelines, rules, laws, ideas, frameworks? Certainly Jesus does dispense some of that, but is that really what he was and what he imagined himself to be doing? Magical claims, that word got a lot of attention on Twitter, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But basically what I understand that is claims, historical claims which break the laws of physics or the laws of nature, and at cross purposes with the 21st century. In other words, in certain communities, you will lose status if you believe in miracles. Now, was Jesus a moral philosopher? Did Jesus intend to teach us how to live a better life and how better lives should be lived? And I would argue that certainly he does some of this, but that wasn't at the heart of what he was intending to do. Did Jesus intend to save the world from sin? I think that's exactly what he intended to do. Did he intend to save the world from death? I think that's exactly what he intended to do. And did he intend to save the world from its perpetual cycles of human killing human? Yes, I think that's exactly what he set out to do, which is far more than pretty much any moral philosopher would imagine themselves being able to do. Now, let's get into the magical claims a little bit. C.S. Lewis, in his masterful essay, The Grand Miracle, which you can find on the C.S. Lewis Doodle channel on YouTube, goes into this question. And he makes the point that Buddhism, Islam, for the most part, would do very well without their miracles. The miracles in many of these other religions are embroidery or adornment, these kinds of things. But in my Sunday morning sermons, I've been going through, you can find those sermons on the Rough Draft from Sunday or over on my church YouTube channel, which is a different channel. It's a very different thing that is happening with Jesus' life. Now, magic is normally understood as trying to get what you want by violating or manipulating nature. And actually, I would say that that's a lot of what we do with technology, but that was very much not what Jesus was doing. If you want a good understanding of what Jesus was doing and how C.S. Lewis put this together, I recommend one of my favorite books by C.S. Lewis, which was called Miracles. And he goes into quite a bit of this a lot. Now, if you look at my sermons, what I think you'll begin to see that miracles for Jesus are enacted parables revealing the truth about ourselves and the world and our future. And these parables, these enacted parables, are revealing who Jesus is and how Jesus stands with respect to us and the rest of the created order. Now, many have tried to get rid of these magical claims from Christianity, probably the most famous of which was Thomas Jefferson, who literally, I'm told Apparently the Bible is still available at Monticello. He took a scissors to the Gospels and cut out all the places in which Jesus, in fact, does something miraculous or magical. But part of the issue that anyone who makes this claim faces is that this mode of Christianity has never had legs. Now, you might argue that the people who continue to believe in magical claims or the miraculous, people like myself, that somehow we're dim-witted or not keeping up with the times, and somehow some wave is going to go through humanity and this will all be swept away and everyone will be perfectly rational. People have been calling for this for at least 100 years, and it doesn't seem to be winning. In fact, it seems that for the most part, a small minority seems able to sort of maintain this as a position or attempt to maintain it, while the vast majority of human beings simply believes in all sorts of other things. Clay Rutledge recently wrote a book on this where he and many others, I've had Nathan Jacobs on my channel. Nathan Jacobs is a filmmaker. He's made movies like this. People who have given up religion and even gone to full-blown atheism, many of which don't maintain this imagined magical free life. They simply don't do it. And there's absolutely zero empirical evidence that this type of thinking is banishable from human beings. It's just not or ever going to go away. I really don't think so. Certainly not within our lifetimes. And just basically looking at human beings, quite likely never. So what Bret's goal for the project, I think, is, well, not that different from Jesus' goal in many ways. And so I'm going to play this little clip from this conversation that Bret had with an English scholar, Alistair McGrath. Now, I have a deep appreciation for Alistair McGrath. I just wish he had brought his book Miracles to the talk, because I think he and Bret could have had a wonderful conversation about that book, because essentially what that book asserts is that the church improves its doctrine in sort of a Darwinian fashion, that what heresy is are dead ends for the church. And I would argue that the idea of getting rid of magical claims or miracles is in fact a societal dead end. It doesn't really go anywhere. But let's hear the end of this talk.
Respect. But I am going to just make 2 points, which I think just to show that there's a great discussion to be had here. Okay. Number one, this does sound just like utilitarianism. The language you used very much along those lines. I don't object to that in many ways, but why that theory choice? You know, there is that issue, and also, I admire this noble aspiration to find the highest possible ideal, and I like that. But evolution doesn't really allow you to talk about the highest possible. You know, I'm just worried about that. And also, I think...
Well, his point is that evolution doesn't care about any of your ideals.
You know, David Hume is coming back to haunt us a bit. You know, you cannot move from the empirical to the normative. And so how on earth do we get this? And actually, if I may say it, and this is simply me responding to what I think is a very interesting proposal from you. It's almost as if you're proposing a new religion to meet this new challenge. And I think that's very interesting, but I think you may find some people who would disagree with that.
Oh, people hate it. But I would be careful. It's not a new religion.
Yes.
What it is something that sits in the same place. It addresses some of the same needs, but it is not founded on the same principle. It's founded on an...
And I would love to ask him what that principle is. I just, in fact, released a video where 3 individuals are talking, and I bring up John Vervaeke's work. And in the comments section, John rightly kind of called me out and said, I'm not really trying to found a new religion. And I think that's true. What John and Bret are looking for, it seems, is a way to replace some of the functions that religions have served. Now, my skepticism about that project is based on a lifelong working with religion, with all of the institutions and traditions and stories and narratives and practices and community, and just realizing just how hard that is. And the thing we bump into is not so much usually magical claims, but just basic stubborn humanity, how we really are.
Understanding that what we are wired for is not a good match for what we are capable of. So I do think, and I know I have to say it gently because of the sacred, because of...
You don't have to say it so gently. We're not... Some people are a little bit reactive, but others of us, not so reactive. I'd rather have you... I'm from New Jersey. I'd rather have you be blunt.
People's, what would up until very recently have been a necessary resistance to new ideas corrupting the compendiums of wisdom that they've been handed. But we can all see that we live in circumstances that we have no wisdom for. I mean, in fact, even the world that we were each born into is now gone. Things are changing so rapidly that we couldn't possibly have wisdom that would keep up. So what are we going to do about that question?
And again, when you listen to Bret's comment here, and if you're following John Vervaeke's project, you can see, especially his last number of videos, he's talking about wisdom. How can we develop wisdom? How can we develop communities of wisdom? How can we figure this out? So I'd love to have, maybe Bret and John should have a conversation about what they regard as wisdom. And if they want to have that conversation, I'd be happy to sit in there as the token religious fella.
Can we do something about it while we are fighting each other? I don't think so.
The fighting each other is, again, the clear thing. And this is where you get to, well, is Jesus a moral philosopher? Jesus says things like, love your neighbor. In fact, Jesus says things like, love your enemy. But why don't we love our enemy? And I think Bret could wade in and say, well, there's very real biological reasons, historical reasons, why we basically say we can't afford to love our enemy, because if we love our enemy will destroy us and bad will win and humanity will come to an end.
In some sense, there's a kind of utilitarianism here. I'm not a narrow utilitarian. It would have to be a sort of enlightened utilitarian for me to sign up for it. Otherwise, you can justify...
Enlightened kind of means upgraded.
Things like slavery and the like. But I do think, whether it is unseemly or not, we actually have to contemplate coming up with something novel enough to have a prayer of being up to the challenge of dealing with our problems.
It's an interesting phrase.
And again, watch the whole talk. It was a great talk, and I think both of them modeled exactly the kinds of conversations we need to be having. Now, Bret's goal here for his project, now, from what I've seen from his life in terms of, what he dedicated his work to when he taught at Evergreen, and just his manner. He's not an elitist totalitarian. He's not imagining we're going to somehow instill, Plato's Republic in our midst. But here's the thing. What do we see from people in terms of what religions win? And that's the question. And this is why the word religion, especially for those of us who are religious, why we keep bringing up this word, because basically what religions have been able to do is inculcate large numbers of people with morals and ethics. And now you won't get an argument from me that, we need this today. I'm a pastor. That's what I work in. And that we need better morals and better ethics. And people, in fact, should be performing better with even the aspirational morals and ethics that they have, or even that we should be talking about what our standards should be. But again, we're talking about moral philosophy, and we can talk about moral philosophy all we want. And my question is Jesus really a moral philosopher? Now, it just so happens that my sermon text this week, I've been preaching through the Gospel of Mark, and I've just had all these miracles that Jesus had been doing. And this week, we don't really get a miracle. In fact, Jesus went with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus goes to a certain area, sort of outside the Jewish enclave, and goes up north and goes to an area where, we'll just look at the name of the region, Caesarea, Caesar, Philippi. This is where Greeks and Romans have settled, and in fact, Herod Philip has established and upgraded his city there. So this is much more of a cosmopolitan place that echoes the then ruling imperial regime of Rome over the Jewish people at that point. And on the way, he asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? Now, it's very interesting that no one came up with the idea of a moral philosopher. I don't know if they would have used that conceptualization in their minds, but this is the ideas that they came up with. And some said John the Baptist, and others said Elijah, and still others said one of the prophets. And so, well, certainly John the Baptist and Elijah and other prophets talked, and we might find some connection with at least some culturally appropriate or adjacent idea of moral philosophy, but that's not how people thought of Jesus. What were they thinking of Jesus? What did they think Jesus was for in their utilitarian view of the world? So then Jesus asked his disciples, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter answered him, Peter speaking for the disciples, "You are Messiah. You are Christ." Well, what on earth does that word mean? Well, it depends what's in their mind. Probably the most dominant idea would be someone who would, as in the beginning of the book of Acts, restore the kingdom to Israel. Someone who would act in a Davidic way, or maybe a Maccabean way, and remove the scourge and impurity of Hellenism and imperial Rome from their people, and have Old Testament prophecies of Israel becoming the center of the world and being purified, and that this would happen. And they imagined that the script for this would be start with a little group of committed people, gather more and more people around, and then at some point you're going to have to make a political and or military move to remove the legions from the area, and this might involve a religious movement of purification for the people. We've seen these kinds of reform movements happen throughout history. This is quite likely something that the disciples were thinking about. Now, they didn't have the hard categories of miracles and non-miracles, although they clearly understood something very unusual and different when they saw it, and that's in fact what gave Jesus credibility. And Jesus in fact was clearly known by the text and even by non-Christian texts such as Josephus for he was a miracle worker. That's what people imagined him to be. And there were other miracle workers around. Just read any ancient text and you'll find all sorts of miracles in them. But now the story continues. Then he began to teach them, well, sounds like a moral philosopher, that the Son of Man. Now, right there you have to pause because most Americans reading that will say, well, human being. But it's code talk, and it's code talk from an Old Testament book of Daniel 7, where there's this figure, this human figure who descends with the clouds from heaven and is given an eternal kingdom over the imperial sea monsters, think Pacific Rim, over the imperial sea monsters that are crunching up the little nations of the world. Okay, this is the conversation that they're having. And Jesus uses this term referring to himself, and basically the Jews around him would have an idea of this Daniel 7 code talk, but the Romans and others outside wouldn't have any understanding of what Jesus is saying. And so Jesus is claiming this title. Jesus is claiming the title of the Son of Man. That Jesus, in fact, is this figure found in Daniel 7 who descends with the clouds and is going to be given an eternal kingdom. Jesus says that's who he is. Now, any moral philosopher that comes around and talks like this, again, you can look at C.S. Lewis's trilemma and say, well, that's a little outlandish, isn't it, Jesus? And if you think this about yourself, ought we to trust anything else what you say? And people say, oh, but Jesus was tolerant and loving and said good things. And when people say that, I often think they really haven't read too much of the New Testament, and they really haven't paused and slowed down and considered not just the miraculous claims or magical claims that you see in the Gospels, but in fact the very regular kinds of stuff Jesus says. Using the title Son of Man referring to himself is one of those. So he begins to talk to his disciples and he says, the Son of Man, meaning himself, must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests. These are the religious authorities of the Jews. And the scribes, these are the teachers, and be killed. He's going to be killed by the Romans. And after 3 days rise again, which is something that's so utterly preposterous, they certainly don't hear, because when it came to Easter Sunday morning, The only ones who showed up at the tomb were the women who were going to finish the embalming work. Those poor women got the dirty work, and they did it because they loved Jesus, but none of the disciples bothered to be there to say, well, maybe. No, didn't act like it. He said all of this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay, no magical stuff here. Peter's listening to him. He doesn't cough at the Son of Man thing. He understands that part. And in fact, Peter is down for that program, but Peter takes him aside to rebuke him. So apparently the Son of Man is a little confused about his mission, according to Peter, even though Peter just said Messiah and Jesus didn't rebut him. But obviously there was a difference in how Jesus imagined Messiahship to be and how Peter and the disciples imagined Messiahship to be. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. So he rebukes him back. And he does it in front of the disciples. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, why would you call your chief disciple Satan? For you are setting your mind not on divine things, well, let's say things at the top of the hierarchy if we're a little nervous about a word like divinity, but not on human things. In other words, Jesus rebukes Peter and says, you have no idea what my mission is. You might have the word right, but you don't know what the word means. And then to make matters worse, because I'll tell you, people think that Jesus is meek and mild, but when you take a look at Jesus in the Gospels, he makes even his best friends and his own family feel uncomfortable enough to think he's out of his mind. So much for a moral philosopher. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Now, this word cross, you should read Tom Holland's book, Dominion. You only have to read the first part, the introduction. In fact, you can listen to the audiobook and listen to that introduction, which Tom Holland himself reads, to get a sense of, in the first century, what that word meant. It feels a whole lot different today than how it felt in that time. Take up your cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Now, it's really interesting, for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, will save it. Now, I don't know what kind of moral philosophy people think Jesus is putting out here, but this sounds just sort of crazy. And there's no magical claims involved. This basically says that all of these good intentions that we have of saving ourselves and saving each other, and it usually goes in that order, that Jesus says, these you have to abandon. Well, that just sounds nuts. And he goes on, for what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Well, what do you mean gain the whole world and forfeit their life? I thought my whole life was the world. Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? And now right here, I've been thinking lately, I need to go back to the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty video and really give that a whole new treatment, because I find I keep coming back to it and listening to it again. Because the real question in all of this is, what is your life? Do you think you mean your biological life? Or is it this autobiographical story that you think you are? In fact, it's that autobiographical story that if someone offends you, causes you to react. And it's that autobiographical story that if someone wounds your feelings, well, or you get depressed, you might seek to end the biological thing here just in search of ending the pain in that autobiographical thing, which is really more your life than the body here. Okay? And I really should do a whole video on that. But Jesus isn't done. Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation. Now, generation is a word that in English kind of makes us think horizontal, but it's really much more vertical. Many older translations will say race. Well, what race is this? Well, it's the human race. It's us. Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed. And when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels, Well, now again, we're just into more crazy talk here because he's making a claim about the future. And he said to them, "Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God has come with power." Now, what does Jesus mean by that? Now, I'm not going to go too far into this. This is sort of my normal preacher stuff that I do. But again, there's no magical claims in here, except maybe magical claims in the future that, well, do we see the Son of Man coming with his angels? And, well, Peter was ashamed enough of Jesus so that he denied him 3 times, and there's that whole part of the story. But you can very quickly see that as a moral philosopher, Jesus is a very strange one. Now, we might seek to demythologize this lesson, but I don't think it's going to help, because Peter knows that going to Jerusalem is a bad political move. Peter knows that going to Jerusalem may very well mean Jesus' death. Maybe Peter thinks that when Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he'll do some magical thing, like a man who can calm a storm can certainly create a storm. Read in ancient histories how many battles had been determined by the weather, whole navies shipwrecking, leading to different tides of empire changing hands in the Mediterranean. And Jesus, who could, at least claimed, raise a man with a word, could likely kill an army with a word. So maybe Jesus was going to go down to Jerusalem and walk into the Antonia fortress and just silence everyone, sort of like some Jedi. But Peter's not sure, because Jesus hasn't seemed to use that kind of power at all. And so he thinks that, well, if they go down there, moral philosopher though he may be, Jesus will get killed. And he doesn't want Jesus killed. And he has an idea of what Jesus should do to save the world. And that idea is pretty much political. And Peter's idea of world saving seems to be in conflict with a lot of other people. Now, this you can find in the Arch of Titus in Rome, depicting the triumph that happened, the celebration, after Titus, in fact, in 70 AD, about 40 years after this episode, went down and, in fact, put down a revolt in Judea and destroyed the temple and killed a good number of people and showed everyone that Rome is boss. So, well, Jesus' moral philosophy, how well did that go, at least in Peter's mind? Because, of course, Peter's in the midst of a first century Judean culture war where you have the aristocracy who are keeping up with the times and the winners. And they're saying, here in this day and age, everyone knows that the Roman way and Hellenism, that's the way to live your life in the world. Now, of course, there are the zealots who are looking at any chance they can to knife a Roman and kick out the Romans out militarily. And you have the Essenes who are sort of living in desert bunkers and caves, hoping that God will nuke the whole lot of them, all the compromisers, people who are still living with Romans and doing business with them. And then there are the Pharisees, who are the symbolic moral culture war, where they're watching all of these dietary laws and they're watching all of these cleanliness laws, and they're encouraging the people to have this soft resistance. It's like, resist Rome, and one day we'll get our chance, and God will maybe send us a leader who will kick them out. And in terms of all of these parties, Jesus seems most close to the Pharisees. But Nicodemus in John 3 comes to try to recruit Jesus, and what becomes painfully obvious is that Jesus, moral philosopher though he be, seems to not be able to be recruited by anyone. They want to recruit Jesus for Team Pharisee, but Jesus basically says there's only Team Jesus and Team Satan. Well, what do you mean by that? Jesus calls Peter Satan. Well, René Girard really said it well when he said it this way. Jesus is the only man to live on this earth in such a way that he can destroy single-handedly the kingdom of Satan. You might say, well, what's the kingdom of Satan? The kingdom of Satan rests upon the fact that ultimately we do his bidding. He says that the victim he offers us as scapegoat is the guilty, and we take him as guilty. And then we divinize the victim, and then we have order. And Rene Girard says this is basically how human beings have worked pretty much all along. This is the source of religion, and this is what religion is for, to try and minimize the killing and maximize the flourishing. Again, this is not a goal that Bret would differ with. He is expelled, and he is the scapegoat, but he takes it upon himself. Jesus willingly becomes the scapegoat. He is a willing scapegoat. He prefers to die, in other words, rather than to share in the sacrificing of others. He prefers to die rather than to join the mob with Peter. The kingdom of Satan is autonomous in the sense that it is a circle of violence that is shut upon itself. This is very much what Bret is talking about in his video. And I think what Bret is looking for is a way out of the kingdom of Satan. And I don't think that a way can be found out merely by a moral philosophy. The kingdom of Satan is autonomous in the sense that it is a circle of violence that is shut upon itself. Jesus opens it. Jesus violates the rules with impunity. Finally, they kill him, and it doesn't do any good. Now, right here, you have the question about magic. Because if Jesus just stayed dead, which is what happened to everyone else that hung upon a Roman cross, the disciples would have been cowering in the upper room. But then something happened. Now, Christianity asserts that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to his disciples, and this changed them. It was exactly the magical claim that changed the world. It wasn't just a new philosophy. It wasn't just a new idea. It wasn't a new management of the kingdom of Satan that offers fewer victims than before, because in fact, none of us get out of this world alive. It was a magical claim that changed the lives of the disciples. Now, Bret is not far off. Bret notes that the kingdom of Satan, or the way of Satan, is untenable. And we've just got way more powerful tools now to end each other than we ever had before. And Bret and Peter both have some sort of future in mind that is preferred. Certainly, many of us certainly agree with all of them. Most of us share it. But none of us can find biological justification for it. It's exactly the miracle claims, as C.S. Lewis points out, that makes this different. In fact, I would assert it's even more devastating than that, because the vision itself comes from these claims. Now, again, I mentioned the Matt Dillahunty conversation with Jordan Peterson, and that really is a fun video to watch. Because basically Matt Dillahunty, along with many others, wants to argue that, well, what's the source for this generosity by which posterity must be preserved, by which human beings must somehow find a steady state by which we can maybe find the right population, maybe find a sustainable level. And again, I would point you to C.S. Lewis's Life in the Atomic Age, because whereas it's this wonderful vision we have of human beings going on, and we probably have lots of other riders on that vision, like all of these human beings going on will think the kinds of thoughts that we have and have the kind of ideals that we have and the values that we have. But that's just really flights of imagination. But we say, well, this is something that is built into us from biology. This is something that has been passed on to me by my ancestors who had it. And Matt Dillahunty, well, this is an instinct, and it's because my ancestors wished that posterity would be preserved, that I want to too. It's an instinct. Now, C.S. Lewis doesn't play this game, and so I'll be reading out of his book, The Abolition of Man. Telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. People say different things. So do instincts. Our instincts are at war, just like people are. And this is exactly what we're trying to deal with. If it is held that the instinct for preserving the species should always be obeyed at the expense of other instincts, whence do we derive the rule of precedence? In other words, once you have a value, you have a hierarchy. And how does instinct determine where it is on the hierarchy? To listen to that instinct, speaking in its own cause and deciding it is in its own favor, would be rather simple-minded. Each instinct, if you listen to it, will claim to be gratified at the expense of all the others. In fact, this gets very complicated because often the instincts arise in moments in time. And, ooh, I feel this instinct. Ooh, I feel that instinct. I feel like posterity ought to be preserved. I feel like mating. I feel like eating. I feel threatened. These are all instincts. By the very act of listening to one rather than to others, we have already prejudged the case. If we did not bring to the examination of our instincts a knowledge of their comparative dignity, we could never learn from them. And that knowledge cannot be instinctive. The judge cannot be one of the parties judged. Or, if he is, the decision is worthless, and there is no ground for placing the preservation of the species above self-preservation or sexual appetite. The idea that without appealing to any court higher than the instincts themselves, now Bret seems to be trying to do this, but we might say, where does this come from? Does it come from biology? Does it come from instinct? This is what C.S. Lewis is engaging. We can yet find grounds for preferring one instinct above its fellows, dies very hard. We grasp at useless words. We call it the basic, or fundamental, or primal, or deepest instinct. It is to no avail. Either these words conceal a value judgment passed upon the instinct and therefore not derided from it, or else they merely record its felt intensity, the frequency of its operation, and its wide distribution. If the former, the whole intent to base value upon instinct has been abandoned. If the latter, these observations about the quantitative aspect of a psychological event lead to no practical conclusion. Just because, obviously, a psychological event is common doesn't give us a place to put it on the hierarchy. It is the old dilemma. Either the premise already concealed an imperative, or the conclusion remains merely in the indicative. And this is exactly what Alistair McGrath was pointing out. Finally, it is worthy inquiry whether there is any instinct to care for posterity or preserve the species. I do not discover it in myself, and yet I am a man rather prone to think of remote futurity. A man who can read Mr. Olaf Stapledon, now that's a science fiction writer in C.S. Lewis's time, see the note below here, with delight. Much less do I find it easy to believe that the majority of people who have sat opposite me in buses or stood with me in queues feel an unreflective impulse to do anything at all about the species or posterity. Isn't this exactly what Bret is noting about us as human beings? We fall apart. In fact, I use this example a lot, and go ahead and make your comment about whether or not you're a climate change believer or a climate change skeptic. I don't care. The struggle against climate change isn't fundamentally a technical challenge. It is a political challenge. And that's exactly why we show ourselves so impotent before it. The struggle of war is a political challenge. The struggle of murder is a political challenge. In fact, as our power has increased, what we've seen is that, wow, exactly what Bret says here, the stakes of our political challenges rise. But we show ourselves continually inept at dealing with political challenges. Why? Because of how we are. Only people educated in a particular way have ever had the idea posterity before their minds at all. It is difficult to assign to instinct our attitude towards an object which exists only for reflective men. What we have by nature is an impulse to preserve our own children and grandchildren. An impulse, well, if you want to move a crowd, show them one child, because one child might move our hearts, but a million is just a statistic, right? So what we have is the impulse to save our own children and grandchildren, an impulse which grows progressively feebler as the imagination looks forward and finally dies out in the deserts of vast futurity. No parent who were guided by this instinct would dream for a moment of setting up the claims of their hypothetical descendants against those of the baby actually crowing and kicking in the room. Those of us who accept the Tao, and you'd have to read the whole book to understand the context of that, those of us who accept the Tao may, perhaps, say that they ought to do so, but that is not open to those who treat instinct as the source of value. As we pass from mother love to rational planning for the future, which is exactly what Bret is proposing, from the realm of instinct into that of choice and reflection, and if instinct is the source of value, planning for the future ought to be less respectable and less obligatory than the baby language and cuddling of the fondest mother or of the most fatuous nursery anecdotes of a doting father. If we are to base ourselves upon instinct, these things are the substance, and the care for posterity, the shadow, the huge flickering shadow of the nursery happiness cast upon the screen of an unknown future. I do not say this projection is a bad thing, and neither do I. But I do not believe that the instinct is the ground of value judgment. What is absurd is the claim that your care for posterity finds its justification in instinct, and then to flout at every turn the only instinct in which it is supposed to rest, tearing the child almost from the breast to the creche and kindergarten in the interest of progress and of the coming race. In other words, this instinct argument doesn't go anywhere. So what can you base it upon? Is it merely a moral philosophy that posterity must be preserved? But what kind of posterity? Because for the most part, that's what we're fighting about, isn't it? Aren't we really fighting about whether Democrats or Republicans or socialists or anarchists or any other community of ists will somehow inherit the earth? And Jesus' suggestion that the meek will inherit the earth seems completely preposterous. So Jesus' magical claims are, in fact, I would argue, necessary for what Bret wants. These are not a bug, but a feature. We are to say no to our instincts, no to our coding. But where can we find the strength and the encouragement to say no to our coding? Well, it's found in this magical thinking. Otherwise, the thing doesn't work. You must have a motivation which defies them and is yet built upon them, which is pretty much exactly what Jesus has done. And it's worked, in fact, for 2,000 years. Now, are people able to pull off being like Jesus? Often only rarely. But the ideas still persist. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of Bret's vision are in fact built on the same ideals. But it's precisely the magical thinking that gives it traction amongst the people. And you might say, oh, okay, so this is the kind of thing that lesser people should be able to do. Now, someone might argue, well, you're just making up self-sacrifice, and that why does Christianity have a corner on self-sacrifice? People have been sacrificing themselves for their children and their countrymen and for other noble ideas for many, many years. Certainly, Socrates sacrifices himself in a certain way. And I'd recommend, again, reading René Girard, contrasting Jesus' sacrifice and Socrates' sacrifice. Tom Holland picks this up in his book, Dominion. Greeks and Romans were no stranger to the tales of self-sacrifice. Their more edifying histories were rife with them. A philosopher might gnaw off his own tongue and spit it in the tyrant's face. A warrior captured by an enemy might demonstrate his resolve by plunging his hand into a blazing fire. Exemplars such as these had always been features of the Roman schoolroom. The values that they instilled in the young were precisely what had enabled Rome to conquer the world. And Lewis in The Abolition of Man would not counter this. He would say this is all part of the Tao. They served to illustrate the qualities of steel that had made the Roman people great. All the more grotesque, then, that criminals condemned to the arena, obliged to submit to the ministrations of torturers, penetrated by spears or swords, should have presumed to lay claim to them as well. Indeed, to the Roman authorities, the pretensions of the martyrs were liable to seem so ludicrous, so utterly offensive, as to verge on the incomprehensible. Had the governor who sentenced to death the Christians of Lyon and Vienna read the accounts of his actions sent to the churches of Asia, he would only have been the more disgusted. Those things reckoned by men low and invisible and contemptible, so the letter proclaimed, are precisely what God ranks as deserving of greater glory. In illustration of this submissive message, it dwelt particularly on a slave girl named Blandina. Every torture inflicted on her, every torment she had fearlessly endured, the radiance of her heroism had put even her fellow martyrs in the shade. Blandina's mistress, although sentenced to the arena as well, did not merit being named. Other Christians, those who had lost their nerve and renounced Christ, were dismissed as flabby athletes who had failed to train. It was Blandina who had won every bout, every contest, and therefore secured the crown. That a slave, a slight, frail, despised woman, might be set among the elites of heaven, seated directly within the splendor of God's radiant palace, ahead of those who in the fallen world had been her immeasurable superiors, was a potent illustration of the mystery that lay at the heart of the Christian faith. In the arena, so it was reported to the churches of Asia, Blandina's broken body had seemed transfigured. Her fellow martyrs, in the midst of their own agonies, had looked upon their sister and seen in her person the one who was crucified for them. Irenaeus had no doubt that a woman such as Blandina, when the lash bit her, felt pain just as Christ had done. This was the assurance that steeled a martyr for death. The willingness of Christians to embrace excruciating tortures, which to those who sentenced them could only appear as lunacy, was founded upon an awesome conviction that their Savior was by their side. Magically? Mere metaphor? More than the temples and the fields for which the antique heroes of Rome had been willing to sacrifice themselves, Christ's present was something real. He was there in the arena as once he had been nailed to the cross. To emulate his sufferings was to impose a meaning on the blankness and the inscrutability of death. Catching up here. But is it just a trick? Is it just a mental trick that we pull on each other? Are we Mr. Burns in the halls of the elite wanting Christianity for the subservient masses to keep them down? Those games don't work. We watch each other very carefully for corruption. In fact, if maybe we have a hyperactive agency detector, we likely have at least as an active corruption detector. We don't believe this stuff. We don't lay down our lives for posterity unless we have good reason, unless we see things that we really believe. If we figure out our leaders don't believe their moral philosophy, or if we don't live by it ourselves, they don't follow it. They won't listen to us. In fact, in Blandina's case, her mistress wasn't the athlete and didn't have the training. And it was even the slavery of Blandina that probably taught her the courage, the conviction, the persistence that led her to outshine even her mistress, who was never named and never remembered. Jesus clearly believed it because he went first. And that begs the question, why did the disciples follow? This isn't just magical stuff you can take out of the text. This is the heart of the story that I would argue has built everything that we benefit from today. The issue that I have with such ideas is very much the end of chapter 1 in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And all the time, such as the tragic comedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that our civilization needs is more drive or dynamism or self-sacrifice or creativity. It's exactly the word Bret used. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. And the best line in the book, we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful.